MintCast, the weekly podcast from Impress News that goes behind the headlines and shares the stories corporate media doesn't want you to hear. Find us at mintpressnews.com, and you can support us on Patreon at patreon.com/mintpressnews. Neoconservative is a phrase that is used constantly in news and politics as prominent neoconservatives, or neocons as they are often known, push for regime change and war in Iran and Venezuela and other geopolitical hotspots around the world. But what does that term mean, and who are these neocons? Today, myself and co-host Alan MacLeod are joined by musician and filmmaker Robbie Martin. You can find Robbie on Twitter at Fluorescent Gray. Robbie is based in the Bay Area, California, and is the creator of the documentary film trilogy A Very Heavy Agenda, which explores the rise of the neoconservative movement in Washington, D.C., how they came to dominate foreign policy from the late 90s to today, and how they have returned to force in the Trump era. You can find his documentary films on averyheavyagenda.com. Robbie is also the co-host of the Media Roots podcast with Abby Martin. Welcome to the show, Robbie.
Thanks for having me, guys. Glad to be here.
Yeah, so when two people interview someone, we often do a sort of good cop, bad cop thing, but I think today it might be like a smart cop, dumb cop thing, and I'm definitely the dumb cop in this one. So my first question, Robbie, is could you just sort of explain what you mean by neocon? It's a term that you hear quite a lot in the political world, but it rarely seems to be actually defined. To me, neoconservatism means kind of like a school of thought or a movement that came into power during maybe the administration of George W. Bush in the 2000s. And then people like Dick Cheney, Bush's vice president, Paul Wolfowitz, Bush's deputy secretary of defense and former president of the World Bank Group, or Robert Kagan, the conservative writer and historian. A lot of people thought to be neocons cut their teeth in the Ronald Reagan administration in the 80s. And the main thrust of their ideology seems to be, to a layman anyway, to be a conservative domestic agenda with a very warlike foreign policy where they see the US as this ultimate arbiter of the world, and neocons advocate for attacking any country and toppling any foreign government that doesn't see eye to eye with the US. For instance, Iraq, Libya, North Korea, Venezuela. So it's this complete dominance of the world that they're trying to offer the US. Is that a fair statement of what it means? What do you think?
I mean, yeah, all the things you said are very true. And there are different ways to define neoconservatism. And I go back to the original when the original term was coined. It was coined by a critic of Bill Kristol's father, Irving Kristol. For his ideology and his point of view. And Irving Kristol said that essentially what turned him into being conservative from being liberal was being mugged by reality. And so the term neoconservative back then literally meant someone who was liberal and believed in the liberal ethos of sort of the 60s and the 70s who turned conservative, who was sort of faced with the harsh, cold reality of the world, and grew up and became an adult. So neoconservatism was originally defined by a critic of Bill Kristol's father, Irving Kristol, because of the ideology that he held at the time, which essentially he was this political writer who flipped from being a liberal and believing of sort of the liberal values of the time to being a conservative. And one of his critics called him a neocon, someone who flipped from being liberal to conservative. And in Irving Kristol's own words, he described that process, that transition for him as being mugged by reality, which to him sort of meant, being faced with the harsh, cold realities of the world. And, it's time to grow up and be an adult and sort of face what America's role should be in the world and things like that. But throughout the 70s, this was like in the early 70s as the term actually came into existence. But throughout the 70s, there was this guy who sort of largely defined that ethos before the Reagan era, and it was a Democratic senator named Scoop Jackson. And one of the people you mentioned earlier, Paul Wolfowitz, who I would describe as like the arch neocon of the Bush administration. He sort of cut his teeth by writing speeches and being a staffer for Scoop Jackson. And so did actually a lot of these other neocons. I think actually Elliot Abrams did as well. And Scoop Jackson was probably one of the most hawkish Democratic senators at the time. Almost think of him almost like as a John McCain of that era. Even though, John McCain's not a Democrat, he sort of, was apart from the Republican Party. And the neocons from that time period were really particularly interested in moving the needle of the foreign policy debate. So by having someone like a Democrat like Scoop Jackson taking this very hawkish position against Russia and the Soviet Union at the time was very valuable, because as we see today, crossing party lines and getting sort of this hawkish foreign policy to spread across the aisle almost seems to be the goal of the neocons now. And so, apart from just pushing war all the time, which they primarily do, one of their main goals is also to sort of spread their ideology around as wide and as broad as possible in D.C.
Well, it's interesting you bring up that backstory, how originally it was people who were, on the left, so ostensibly on the left, and then moved to be conservative, and that they have this, interest that we're seeing more of now with, having dominated sort of the right in the U.S. and then also trying to spread that back to the left where they supposedly originated, which is kind of an interesting. So, and that, of course, brings us to the idea of this sort of bipartisan nature of the neocons and how this is sort of, as you say, sort of the long-term goal. I feel like, in recent years, especially, we've really seen a lot of the neocons, sort of become members of like the so-called, anti-Trump resistance movement, like woke Bill Kristol and all this stuff. Have you seen, would you agree that in recent years, that ultimate goal of neoconservatism, to sort of dominate both sides of the foreign policy debate has been successful?
100%. I mean, it's never been, as far as I've been paying attention to politics, I mean, since really the Bush administration, when I've been most aware, it's never been this bad before, in terms of the consensus of, largely agreeing with neocon foreign policy across DC. Maybe right after 9/11, was arguably the last time there was this much consensus, because of how many people voted for, the AUMF, for example, which is a very neocon, construct, in my opinion. But no, I don't think, I think this is almost the worst I've ever seen it.
Right. And one of the main, foreign policy issues right now is Russia. Just a few years ago, the idea of Russia being the enemy number one or any threat to the United States was literally laughable. I remember in 2012, during the presidential campaign, Mitt Romney claimed that Russia was a big geopolitical rival of the US, and Hillary Clinton and John Kerry mocked him for being out of touch, and he became the butt of jokes for all these cable news hosts like Rachel Maddow and Chris Hayes for days. In fact, I remember Barack Obama even said the 1980s called and they want their foreign policy back. And yet, well, now some of the neocons from the 80s are back, and the US has made Russia its enemy again, funding anti-Russian forces in Ukraine, for instance, or expanding NATO to Russia's borders, or attacking Russia's allies in Syria, for instance, and just generally threatening Putin. How have the neocons become involved in all of this again?
Well, it's a really good question. I mean, interestingly, that debate moment that you're referring to, where Mitt Romney said that, he was actually being advised by two very influential neoconservatives who were associated with PNAC, Bill Kristol's outfit, out of DC.
PNAC is Project for the New American Century, right? That think tank.
Yes.
In Washington. Okay.
Correct. Yeah. Which many people argue, and they're right, is that they were chiefly responsible for creating the blueprints and the propaganda blueprints for the Iraq War. They had, I believe, 17 members of their think tank transition into the Bush administration. So, that's one of the largest transitions that I know of on record of a think tank going into administration. That's kind of old news now, but Dan Senor and Robert Kagan is the co-founder of PNAC, were actually two of Mitt Romney's policy advisors during those debates. And they were, pushing this anti-Russian stuff openly, even before 2012. There are speeches of Robert Kagan from the 90s, I think from the American Enterprise Institute or some other think tanks, where he's basically talking about how with the end of the Cold War, we need to figure out a way to face a belligerent Russia if they become belligerent again. And the whole framing of it is basically they will become belligerent again and we will need to face them again. So we should start preparing now to figure out how to do that and how to take advantage of that. And, not that many years later, they're already trying to, insert Russia into the debate in 2012. And they were widely laughed at and mocked, whatever that idea was. And I don't say they weren't mocked because nobody really knew they were advising, Mitt Romney. But yeah, it's really interesting how, what they've been doing basically is they've been at the tip of the spear and trying to push this debate in DC. And, they've been just really, really dedicated to it. So, even before 2012, they were heavily pushing, for example, the Magnitsky Act. And a lot of these neocons were responsible for creating sort of a PR campaign to get that to really stick. And we know John McCain, for example, was instrumental in getting that bill to pass, I believe, through the Senate in the U.S. And John McCain is someone who plays a really interesting role here, where he seems to be the conduit for most of this sort of anti-Russian hysteria from the neocon think tanks directly. They're stovepiping stuff directly to him, and they have been since the passing of the Magnitsky Act. So they've basically just been inching forward and forward this awareness or this fear of Russia to the point where, and then it really came to a head with Ukraine, of course. And we saw in that example that Robert Kagan's wife, who happened to be the Assistant Secretary of Eurasian Affairs at the time under the Obama administration, actually played this really crucial role in playing musical chairs with the Ukrainian government. And she was caught on tape doing so. You can really draw a direct line going all the way from these neocon think takers all the way until the Ukraine coup. So that's really when it all came to a head. And then, of course, it's all this Russia hysteria now is, I see it almost more as an extension of all that stuff that had previously happened. So Trump getting in the middle of Russiagate, I almost just see as sort of the last stage of a giant train that these neocons have created, this unstoppable train that's just been building momentum. And by the time Ukraine happened, it was just unstoppable. The momentum was just almost self-perpetuating at that point. I mean, you had magazine covers all over the country with Putin's face on it, even before Trump was a presidential candidate. So, this has been going for quite a while. So, I don't know if I properly answered your question, but.
No, that was good. And
it was
clear.
fine.
The Magnitsky Act, that was basically sanctions on Russia, wasn't it? Because of this man, Sergei Magnitsky, who died in Moscow in a prison, right?
Yes, they were heavy sanctions, and I think they were it was the style of sanctions that we've seen more recently, where they're sanctions on specific individuals in Russia, like Russian oligarchs and police chiefs and stuff like that.
Okay.
So going back to Russiagate, which you were bringing up at the end there, I think it's worth touching on that for a second in connection with the neocons, right? Because, frequently, and especially now, that the Mueller reports come out and all of this, Trump is really taking it upon himself to sort of promote all of Russiagate as sort of this Democrat-funded, Democrat-planned, hoax, as he calls it. But actually, there's actually a lot of neoconservative links to the beginning of Russiagate, including the Steele dossier, which was that really salacious dossier about all these claims about Trump and Russia that was published by BuzzFeed a few years ago and really started a lot of the Russia hysteria and Trump is Putin has dirt on Trump and all that stuff, right? So. There's a couple angles to go there. So, for example, with the Steele dossier, there's the involvement of a major neocon donor, and then Fusion GPS also has some neocon links there. Is there anything you'd like to add about that? Maybe.
For sure. I mean, this whole notion that this is a Democrat. I mean, I would agree with Trump on some level that the Russiagate investigation was a witch hunt of some kind.
Right.
That seemed very clear to me from the beginning. Even the allegation that Russia had actually hacked the DNC and passed the emails to WikiLeaks, that still has not been proven at all to me. And I'm still waiting for the proof of that. But that aside, the Steele dossier, the origins of it are very, very interesting to me. Because here's a guy, Chris Steele, who knew Litvinenko, another prong in sort of the neocon propaganda build against Russia. Litvinenko was someone who was very crucial after the Magnitsky Act was passed to try to essentially paint Russia as a country that murders its own citizens, or just murders, just like political assassinations. And that
Litvinenko is the Russian spy who was poisoned in the UK. Is that right?
That's correct. Yeah, and he was actually close to Chris Steele. And what I find interesting just about that connection in and of itself is that, Litvinenko, most of the people who are already sort of very aware of Litvinenko and his family and knew him were associated with this group of neocons, including Bill Browder. He was actually close to Litvinenko's spouse as well. So there's this little network that's existed, that's kind of been building itself up. All these people, all these players. And so Chris Steele was hired apparently by Fusion GPS, on behalf of the DNC, when they had taken on the work of this Oppo research from Trump. But what's interesting about that for me is it doesn't make sense to me that the Democrats would have been crafty enough or smart enough to even suggest tracking down Chris Steele or hiring him. And the guy who runs Fusion GPS, Glenn Simpson, has been basically concocting this Trump-Russia theory since like the 90s, I believe. So I guess the most important part of the Steele dossier story for me is that the organization who originally hired Fusion GPS to do Trump Oppo research was a neocon organization called the Washington Free Beacon, which is funded by a top neoconservative GOP donor named Paul Singer. And also the outlet was funded by a project for the New American Century alumni named Michael Goldfarb. Now, Michael Goldfarb is interesting as well because he also worked as a Georgian lobbyist and was close with Saakashvili, I believe the prime minister of Georgia at that time. So you have this little network here of these people who have connections to UK intelligence, have connections to, these Eastern European puppet governments, essentially, that are propped up by the United States. And then for some reason we're supposed to believe that the Steele dossier was only concocted after the Democrats took over the Fusion GPS project. And I just find that pretty much impossible to believe, especially because of what we know now is that John McCain and Victoria Nuland, two people who are basically neocon conduits, were basically the ones responsible for getting the Steele dossier the attention of the State Department and the FBI in the first place within the Obama administration. So that's where that's where my brain goes with that. So I think that we need to unpack this whole thing. And I think if Trump's Attorney General William Barr does an investigation to figure out how this happened, it's going to have to be awfully narrow because it's going to open up some unsavory doors to the fact that, the GOP was actually against Trump at one time, and a lot of the neocon, were as well. So this is not just a Democrat witch hunt. There are a lot of, big time right wing GOP players who are involved in this as well, I believe.
Right. Well, just to add to that, I think one more neocon connection that I just learned about recently in connection to that is that Glenn Simpson, right, who's one of the Fusion GPS co-founders, he used to work as a senior fellow at this think tank called the International Assessment and Strategy Center, and that was founded by Arthur Waldron, who used to head the Asia Studies Center at the American Enterprise Institute, which is for listeners that don't know, that's one of the major neoconservative think tanks that employed Paul Wolfowitz, John Bolton. a lot of these big name neoconservatives. So it's just really interesting to me, and since we're talking about the bipartisan nature of what, neoconservatism has become, it's just really interesting that like even something that's being framed as such a partisan issue, you can even see like the bipartisan currents of what, this political movement has become and something as supposedly partisan as Russiagate.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that's really the key to what's going on. I mean, I think that, they need to maintain this illusion of partisanship, and especially wants to maintain this illusion that the GOP is a unified front behind him. But we all know that the GOP was trying to do a contested convention and strip him of the nomination. I mean, that mentality was there, and it was very strong. So between those 2 years, from then and now, we're supposed to all pretend like, everybody's behind Trump and it's against the Democrats. But as you said, we know that there was a bipartisan effort to do this, and even possibly get him impeached. I mean, it seems like that was the goal of Russiagate, perhaps, or one of the goals, I should say. Because we've discussed, Whitney, that it seems like one of the main goals is actually to censor the internet, which oddly, and, not that surprisingly, the Project for the New American Century in rebuilding America's defenses, one of the main goals that they lay out in that paper is control of cyberspace.
Right.
And that's kind of what we're seeing now. I mean, they don't lay it out in the detail that we're seeing now, but that's essentially what they wanted. And they kind of are getting their wish.
Right. I mean, I think we've seen that too with things like Hamilton 68, which was sort of used a lot with this whole Russiagate promoting bit, and that, was associated with Bill Kristol and things like this, and all of this, Russian disinformation campaigns and all of that in 2016. So considering what went on with all of that in the aftermath of the last election, what do you see in terms of those efforts to control cyberspace or independent media and things like that? What do you predict that getting worse, and to what extent worse ahead of the 2020 election?
Oh my God! I mean, now that you've thrown the election into there, I mean, I think, sadly, I think it's going to get worse. And I think that, I mean, this is not even that crazy of a prediction. I think it's obviously going to happen. Is that in 2020, we're going to see massive news stories, floods of news stories talking about how there are foreign actors trying to meddle in the 2020 election. And so get ready for that, because that's going to be, they're going to try to throw a wrench in that.
Yeah, I mean, from one political foe to another, I mean, I wanted to talk to you about Iran as well. I mean, right now, that's really where the U.S. administration has its eye. I mean,
yes,
there's definitely been a push in the Trump administration to bring the U.S. to the brink of war with Iran. So, for instance, it was recently reported that John Bolton ordered the military to get ready to send 120,000 troops there, and that's actually a number that's quite similar to what they invaded Iraq with. And there's been a number of quite half-hearted scandals that appear designed to act as pretenses to, stoke the flames of war. One that we talked about last week on the show was the damaging of these Saudi oil tankers in the Straits of Hormuz. How real is that threat of war with Iran? And is it something the neocons have been thinking about for a long time?
Yeah, I mean, the path to war with Iran with the neocons is an interesting one, because they've been trying to get war with Iran, forever. And it's, we've mostly seen a climb towards war with Iran, a slow climb since the Bush administration. That had a setback in the form of the Iran deal in the second term of the Obama administration, which I would argue was really one of the only good things Obama did during his presidency. And that deal seemed to kind of turn the heat down on that climb. What the Trump administration has done is, started that clock over again, that climb, and they've turned the speed up on it quite a bit. So the pieces that are putting in place now are really escalating things at a very quick level here. And specifically, all the new sanctions that they've put on, the harshest sanctions so far on Iran. And this is all sort of coming after all the rhetoric that we've heard from the Trump administration about how Iran is as the world's largest sponsor of terrorism. They've already declared the Iranian Revolutionary Guard a terrorist organization. All these little moves that the Trump administration are doing are designed to escalate us closer to war. And the neocons, of course, would argue, no, we don't want war. Turn the pressure up on Iran so they change their behavior. That's what a neocon would sort of disingenuously argue. But the reality is the neocons are very good at raising the stakes and creating these situations where just a small spark could start something very serious. And I think that that's essentially their real goal, is they want to keep turning up the pressure against Iran so that if Iran does just something very little and makes one misstep, that it would be enough to basically spur some kind of military assault on their country. And if we're talking about the neocons in Trump's administration now, there does seem to be a particularly hawkish flavor with certain people in his administration who have been very obsessed with going after Iran specifically. And there was a split among sort of the neocon consensus around maybe 2007, 2008, where a lot of neocons stopped talking about invading or going after Iran. And they sort of put on the back burner. And I listened to an interesting interview once with a neocon named Jonathan Kay, who's now this anti-social justice warrior writer for Quillette, who said that the reason why he doesn't call himself a neocon anymore is because of the neocons' obsession with going after Iran, and he felt that was too extreme for him. So there was this kind of a split back then between neocons who, and I would say neocons who say they want to invade Iran and say they don't want to. And what I don't mean is that the neocons actually don't want to invade Iran versus wanting to invade Iran. Because I believe that all of them on some level do want regime change in Iran. They just know that in certain circles and quarters, talking about it makes you sound like a psychopath. So they know not to talk about it. So that's basically the split I'm referring to. It's just basically a PR split. But yeah, I mean, I think this is seriously, could really go off here. And I'm not taking it lightly at all. At first I was, because what Americans are going to give a shit if Saudi oil tankers have some tiny holes in them? I mean, no one's going to care about that. But then just a few days later, that Iran, the supposedly Iranian Katyusha rocket falls in the green zone, right after they move all these American personnel out and warn about Iranian terrorist attacks in the green zone. So they're trying to pull things here. And I just hope that some provocation isn't staged, or some kind of event isn't staged to actually make Americans want to get on board with this, because I don't see anybody getting on board with it right now, the direction that it's going. But that doesn't mean that the Trump administration wouldn't do it, just because they couldn't get the public to go along. So.
Right, and these things can also happen just by accident, can't they? I mean, if you look on a map, Iran is completely surrounded by US bases, whether it's in Afghanistan or Iraq or other parts of the Middle East, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain. They're almost completely surrounded. And yet these sorts of provocations seem extremely banal, actually. When you look at the damage that those Saudi ships had, it looked like the sort of damage a rock might do. There was no casualties. I don't think there was even any injuries. And yet it seems that the pushback for war against Iran seems to be coming primarily from military figures who are saying this is a crazy idea, perhaps because we don't really have an organized and large-scale anti-war movement in the West, really. A lot of people are saying, if we would invade Iran, it would be another Iraq, a catastrophic war with huge casualties that you can never get away from. But frankly, I think that might be the best case scenario, because Iran is a bigger country, a much more organized military, a people who are generally unified against US intervention. My worry is that could be just a calamity on an enormous scale that we haven't seen for decades.
Oh, you're absolutely right. There would be no comparison to any modern war that the U.S. has launched. It would be absolutely catastrophic. And the disturbing part is that there was even talk during the Obama administration of using nuclear weapons on Iran. So you can only imagine what kind of talk has gone in within the confines of the Trump administration about using tactical nukes or MOABs. My feeling is that if the Trump administration did something, they would do something really brutal and quick and fast as sort of almost like in their mind, like a death blow to make Iran surrender. That's the mentality I think that the Trump administration is operating on. So I wouldn't put anything past them. But I don't think that they would just send in like ground troops and do an Iraq style, normal bombing campaign. When I say normal bombing campaign, it sounds horrible, but I mean, I actually fear that Trump might actually drop a nuke, if I'm really being honest.
Well, we sort of saw this with Tom Cotton, right, who I would definitely consider to be a neoconservative senator.
Absolutely.
He was, I think it was on PBS's firing line, he was saying something like, war with Iran would be really fast and easy, it would be swift, and we would just hit them twice. 2 big strikes or something. But, the unspoken thing there is like, how big would those strikes have to be for it really to be, a definitive end of any sort of war, like a 2-strike war? I mean, obviously, to me, it sounded like an unspoken mention of nukes there. And what's really interesting about talking about nukes in Iran, well, it's also really disturbing, I would say, are the role of like these major neoconservative donors in directing Trump's Iran policy. So, for example, like Paul Singer, who we were talking about earlier, who gave Trump like $1 million after he was elected. Sheldon Adelson is Trump's biggest donor. Both of these guys, their main thing when they were lobbying Trump was about withdrawing from the Iran deal. And, of course they got that. And also, John Bolton, the main reason he's in the administration is because Sheldon Adelson worked with the Zionist Organization of America to get H.R. McMaster fired and have John Bolton replace him. Right? So, I mean, wow. I think that makes Sheldon Adelson really important to pay attention to here. And let's remember what Sheldon Adelson talked about doing in 2015 when the Iran nuclear negotiations were going on. He said any sort of diplomatic engagement of Iran was, quote, the worst idea I could ever imagine. And his idea of negotiating was to nuke an unpopulated area of Iran's desert as a warning, and then threaten that the next nuke would be dropped on top of Tehran, Iran's capital, and that the U.S. could use that as a negotiating tool to negotiate from, quote, a position of strength, right? So, I mean, this is the guy, Sheldon Adelson. I mean, you can really argue that, he's really calling a lot of the shots in the Trump administration. I mean, Trump takes his phone calls all the time. Trump gave some random presidential medal to Sheldon Adelson's wife for no apparent reason, And so I think, Sheldon Adelson is really sort of like an unspoken guy here, and he's clearly a neoconservative donor, in my opinion, because of his closeness to Bolton. I mean, I think that's a pretty troubling giveaway. Do you think that, people are always talking about, John Bolton's influence on Iran policy? Do you think that maybe Sheldon Adelson might have a bit of an outsized role in directing Trump's Iran policy as well?
Absolutely. I mean, if you want to really point the finger at who is driving Trump's foreign policy, especially in regards to, Israel and Iran, I think you could point to someone like him. So I think that it's inappropriate, and I also think that it's, I don't know, I mean, maybe even a little bit naive to suggest that John Bolton is the one holding the reins here, and he's the one pushing Trump into war, and he's so belligerent that Trump can't control him. I see that narrative being put out a lot across all media, alternative media and just mainstream media.
Right.
And I just find that odd. And and part of me wonders if that's something that the Trump administration wants people to believe.
I think it
wants
maybe.
people to believe.
It's like a good cop, bad cop thing, where Bolton's bad cop and Trump is good cop, right?
And we were just talking about that on the Media Roots podcast, that perhaps this is Trump's idea of a negotiating tactic, and then he wants to put out disinformation or misinformation to make people believe that he's a dove and Bolton's a hawk. And I think even, that interview Trump recently did where he said that the military-industrial complex was the one who wanted him to keep more troops in the Middle East. Yeah. To me, that has the same flavor as like good cop, bad cop. It's like right there, he's the good cop.
Totally.
And it's like, but to me, it's bullshit. But Trump is very, very smart. He knows how to do PR. He knows how to control the media. And I think that this is an appearance he wants people to believe. And apparently, this is something that Reuters reported on, and I don't know if I trust the reporting, but it claimed that someone from the Iranian government was trying to get a direct line to Trump because they felt that Bolton was too belligerent and they could appeal to Trump's like reticence to go to war. Now that's interesting to me because that means that good cop, that bad cop dynamic is actually working to their advantage.
Well, I think it's also worked on the American public to a big extent because of how often you see that narrative circulated that, oh, it's Bolton's fault. Oh, we have to fire Bolton, and sort of acting like Bolton was forced upon Trump, even though Trump intentionally chose to appoint him because it's, being national security advisor, you're appointed by the president, right? So it's not like Trump made that decision. So I think it's I would agree with you there. And talking about, Trump's recent comments about, how bad the military-industrial complex is, and he called it by name, a lot of people that still want to cling to that narrative that Trump is secretly anti-war, cited that. And then I think it was just a few days later it came out that the Trump administration was going to circumvent Congress to sell something like $8 billion in weapons to allies in the Middle East, citing the Iran threat, right? So he goes in public, right, and he says, the military-industrial complex is bad, and I'm trying to, sort of made it sound like he's trying to fight against them. And then he goes, just a few days later, and then, you could argue illegally by circumventing Congress, uses executive order to approve billions of dollars in arms sales to the places like Saudi Arabia and Israel and the UAE and stuff like that. So I think, that's a really good example sort of proving this whole good cop, bad cop strategy.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, actions speak louder than words, don't they? And people seem to be really, they just want to, hang on Trump's words and believe he's like an anti-interventionist, don't they? But they're constantly, all the Trump administration are using this phrase, all options are on the table with Iran. And that specifically means nuclear bombing the country to smithereens. In fact, there was a journalist that famously asked one of these neocons back in George Bush's day, what does all options include a nuclear attack? And they just repeated, yes, all options are on the table. So this is really the sort of level of savagery that people have to deal with when talking about the Trump administration.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's what's so fascinating to me about how anybody could still be taking Trump's rhetoric about war at face value. I mean, even someone like Rand Paul, he claims he's in these Oval Office meetings with Trump, and he's trying to appeal to his anti-war side, and he's the only one in the room that agrees with them, and it's strange how many people are still holding on to this narrative. And ultimately, I mean, what we can say for sure is that Trump is a really good con man, and I think that's what we need to remember here is that I mean, especially on this directly, it's like the fact that he's managed to con. Not just like anti-war people on the right, but also anti-war people on the left is pretty impressive. I mean, that's something that, I haven't seen any other president or politician be able to do, at that level before. I mean, you still have Zero Hedge writing articles saying that he's still trying to basically the Zero Hedge narrative is that he's giving the bare minimum to please the military-industrial complex in order to like distract them for the real agenda, which is to stop war. And it's like, really? Come on.
To me, this is kind of reminiscent of how a lot of people saw the best in Obama all the time and insisted that it was, he was trying to do everything he could, but it was really the forces that be that were forcing him to do these things. In terms of like trying to appeal to Trump, he seems like a complete naif who really kind of his brain changed immediately just by finding somebody who says something a bit different. Do you remember he came back from China? He sounded like some sort of revolutionary Maoist, and then he goes off to speak with Putin, and suddenly he sounds like he's Putin's best friend. I think this guy has just got such a low level understanding of politics and ideology. I mean, his ideology is just himself, really. And
well, I think he knows how to play people really well, though, too. So, like, going back to the military-industrial complex bit, like, Trump, since the very beginning of his administration, has made it a cornerstone of his foreign policy to sell weapons. And so much so that the State Department now, the diplomats, basically, when they have any meeting, they have to sort of stump U.S. weapons, and a lot of Trump's, like, make America great again, domestic economic initiatives have been aimed at, like, bumping up weapons sales and stuff like that. And, so to sort of bring this back to the same, vein of neoconservatives, and whatnot, it's really interesting, too, that, like, one of the major neocon think tanks that we could talk about, in relation to the military-industrial complex is the Institute for the Study of War, right, which is founded by Fred Kagan and his wife, Kimberly Kagan. And that's also funded, by major weapon manufacturers that are benefiting hugely from the Trump administration. And, some of the main people in that think tank also sort of, when they go on media appearances, they sort of act like they have this inside line into the Trump administration. Do you have any perspectives on the Institute for the Study of War in that regard, Robbie?
Yeah, well, it's really interesting you bring them up because, as we know, the Kagan, especially Robert Kagan, has actually called Trump Hitler. He's been one of the most outspoken critics of the Trump administration from the neocon camp. And his family runs this. I would say they're probably one of the most crucial war think tanks in D.C., nearly entirely funded by defense contractors. And they have a general that I believe is actually, I want to say like the CEO or something of it, but I'm not sure. I'll have to look it up. But his name is General
like
Jack
chairman
King.
or something, or vice chairman or something, I think, yeah.
Yeah, and he, and when the Institute for the Study of War, when Trump first got in, I was kind of wondering to myself, will the Institute for the Study of War be working with the Trump administration just like they were with the Obama and the Bush administrations previous? And, at first it seemed like the answer was no. There seemed to be, the Kagans, I'm sure, have a lot of animosity towards Trump. But at the same time, this think tank is, very, very tapped into military operations. I mean, their assessments, their data is so valuable to the military that even Max Boot says that they have more knowledge about what's going on the ground than the U.S. government does. He said that on camera. So, this general goes on Fox News and he's basically talking as if he understands the Trump administration's whole play. Like he can see it, from beginning to end. And I found that kind of fascinating because this was, I've been paying very close attention to these think tanks, and this is the first time I've seen somebody from that think tank appear to actually have a direct eye into the administration. And that makes sense. I mean, at a certain point, I'm sure that think tank would be working with people in the Pentagon, regardless of Robert Kagan's hatred for Trump. But then there's another think tank, the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, that is actually their explicit goal is regime change in Iran. They were a neocon think tank formed after 9/11, I believe, by a guy named Clifford May. And neoconservatives Michael Adine and James Woolsey sit on the board of this think tank. And I don't know if you remember this, where a bunch of bin Laden files were released by the CIA about, I want to say a year ago. Mike Pompeo made this press release, this announcement that they were going to release this bin Laden cache. And what they did is they actually gave exclusive access to the bin Laden cache before they gave it to the public. And they actually never gave the full cache to the public. They only gave it to the Foundation for Defense of Democracies directly, and let the Foundation for Defense of Democracies release these cherry-picked, media leaks and reports claiming that bin Laden and Iran were working together and that Iran had some involvement in 9/11. So the Trump administration has already worked with one of the biggest neocon think tanks out of D.C. To try to basically tie the 9/11 attacks to Iran about a year ago. And I think that it even made its way into some of the 9/11 lawsuits, if I'm not mistaken. But I could be completely wrong.
Yeah, there was a lawsuit, I think, that actually ruled that Iran was responsible. It didn't really do anything, but it was sort of like a PR move, basically, in my opinion, because it didn't have any tangible consequences.
For sure, yeah.
We're speaking with Robbie Martin at Fluorescent Grey on Twitter. He's a filmmaker and a musician. and he did the trilogy A Very Heavy Agenda. Robbie, I wanted to get your opinions on Venezuela as well. And I wanted to get there first by just discussing John Bolton. I know you said, he's not a massive player in this, but I think it's worth thinking about John Bolton because he does seem to be a peculiarly awful human being. I mean, he's one of the most prominent neocons in the news right now. He started off as a campaigner in politics for the racist segregationist Barry Goldwater in the 60s. He went on to work for Senator Jesse Helms in the 80s. And in the 80s, Helms was basically making his name opposing civil rights, LGBT rights, and he even campaigned to block people with HIV entering the US. He's constantly advocating war with Iran and is a driving force in the US policy in Venezuela right now. I heard him on Fox News, and he was very candid, and he said, this is all about oil. He said, quote, "It will make a big difference to the United States economically if we could have American oil companies invest in and produce the oil capabilities in Venezuela." I wanted to ask you, it seems that Juan Guaido, his presidential candidacy in this coup failed. Do you think President Maduro has weathered this storm, and what's the neocons' role been in Venezuela? What do you think?
Oh, that's a good question. Let me try to figure out how to answer. So I think that there's a good sign that I would almost describe it as a show coup, because it doesn't seem like Juan Guaido was really even given significant support by the U.S. other than like PR support for this coup. Apparently he only had, for their most recent attempt, he only had about 80 soldiers. Which seems kind of ridiculous. I mean, I guess in other countries that little soldiers maybe has worked to pull off a coup before. Yeah, it does seem like that if I'm going to guess what the administration wanted, is that John Bolton, is probably ready to do this. I mean, I'm sure that he's not worried about the consequences of a prolonged, sort of foreign policy excursion in South America. It's Donald Trump who has to worry about the public fallout from what the consequences of that will be. So I think there's definitely some truth to the idea that John Bolton, really he has nothing to lose. I mean, sure, Trump could fire him, but this has been something that I'm sure he's had his sights set on for forever. I mean, actually, when I say I'm sure I know he has. He's been obsessed with what he now describes as the troika of tyranny, which is this, which is this sort of unison of different South American nations, and nations south of the equator that do not subscribe to American hegemony, essentially. And that actually, one of his main bones of contention is just Cuba's existence. He's after 9/11, he was actually trying to say that Cuba had a biological weapons program and that we needed to do weapons inspectors there and stuff. So I think this has been a pet project of his for a while. He wanted to sort of bring back this sort of the Monroe Doctrine idea, that he wanted to expand the rhetoric of "Make America Great Again" to make our side of our hemisphere of the world great again kind of mentality, where it's almost seen as acceptable to Trump's base to meddle in South America because it's in our backyard, quote unquote. So I think that was sort of by design as well, that he wanted to sort of, push that. I would say that's definitely John Bolton's idea. But one funny incident, I don't know if you remember this, is that he was caught in a press conference, holding a notepad that said something like 5,000 U.S. troops to Colombia or something.
Yeah.
And the way he was like holding the notepad, like facing the press.
So everyone could see it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that was on purpose, honestly. And I think that and I think that there is some kind of psychological warfare aspect to this neocon good cop, bad cop dynamic. But I don't know if that's why the coup failed, if it was just because Trump was getting cold feet and didn't want to go through with this. I really can't say, but I don't think that Maduro weathered this storm. I think that it's going to come back at him again and again and again and again, simply because Venezuela has the world's largest oil reserves. And as long as they do, the U.S. government and, these other entities are not going to stop trying to overthrow his government. I mean, I don't think that's going to they're not going to give up anytime soon.
Right.
But I do think that the Trump administration wants something that looks good, looks fast, hard, strong, and clean in terms of a war. And if he can't figure out a way to do that, I do think he's reticent about it. So I think that's, I don't know. I mean, I probably said some contradictory things in there, but.
Well, it was interesting. An Argentinian newspaper reported that Juan Guaido, the U.S. Supported president, actually met with Vice President Mike Pence before the coup attempt. And Juan Guaido promised that he could get 50% of the military to join him immediately. And when he did launch this coup, an absolute maximum of 0.1% of the Venezuelan military joined him. And that actually might already be pushing that number way high, because a lot of the people with Juan Guaido were actually retired and seem to have been paramilitaries, not members of the military. And it was also reported that Mike Pence was absolutely furious at this and basically called him back and told him, he read them the riot act.
Well, from what I understand, it was sort of like, the U.S. always thought Guaido had the plan, and Guaido thought that the U.S. had the plan, and then the U.S. thought that maybe Colombia would have a plan, or Bolsonaro and Brazil would have the plan, and everyone else was thinking that someone else had like a full plan developed and no one had it. So I would agree with you, Robbie, that they're going to try this again later. I think they're going to wait for sanctions, which they've beefed up since Guaido declared his parallel presidency and all of this. Especially with like the oil sanctions and whatnot, that they're just going to try and wait for that to, for lack of a better term, sort of soften the country up for an invasion or some sort of paramilitary thing, that they're going to try and keep going for that oil, because, it's not going anywhere. So that's unfortunate for Venezuela.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at Nicaragua in the 80s, the US put sanctions on the country for years and years, and it wasn't until 1989 that the people of Nicaragua basically gave in and elected Violeta Chamorro as their president, who was the US-backed candidate. So this is certainly they could be in it for a long time.
Yeah, I think that that's obviously the strategy that's being used in a long-term sense here right now, is just to destabilize the country, and create such desperation that you need to vote Maduro or the Chavistas out of power. I mean, that's what I think that they've been trying to do, this whole time. But, we'll just have to see what happens. I mean, this embassy standoff was such a bizarre incident too. I don't know how closely you guys were paying attention to that, but the Trump administration were essentially letting the Secret Service, sanction a violent protest against the Venezuelan embassy, where they tried to break down the doors and shit. I mean, it was crazy.
Right. Well, one of MintPress's staff writers was actually inside the embassy, so we followed that pretty closely. We actually had him on our podcast last week. So.
Oh, cool.
That was pretty wild, yeah. So, on that note, that's all the time we have, Robbie. So, where can people follow your work?
Right now, they can follow my work. The most recent stuff I'm doing is regular live streams. Off my own YouTube channel. They can go to my YouTube channel, youtube.com/averyheavyagenda. They can support me on Patreon at patreon.com/Robbie Martin. And, if you want to check out my documentary film about the Neocons and about Cold War 2.0, you can check it out at, averyheavyagenda.com. And, the podcast I do with Abby, Media Roots Radio. It's available on iTunes, SoundCloud, pretty much every platform.
Great. Sounds like you've got a lot of places we can follow you. Okay. Thank you to Robbie Martin for joining us today. You've been listening to the free edition of the MintCast, a podcast from MintPress News. Do subscribe to the show, and you can even support us on patreon.com/MintPressNews. For Whitney Webb and myself, Alan MacLeod, until next week, stay fresh.